That's where we ended up last time.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. I think I know everyone's schedules are really busy this time of year, and you've pumped it in. So I'm going to start right on time. We're also recording this, and so Emma's going to send out the recording, and so please send it to any other faculty or staff or any other people that are joining you in this in your programs. So today's workshop is going to focus specifically on thinking about guiding students along their developmental journey around engaging with other cultures and on programs. So thinking both about how your course content can do this and then your program overall. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some different frameworks that one can use for guiding intercultural learning on a program. We're going to discuss ways that you can build group experiences that are equitable and inclusive. We'll offer you a few suggestions for your pre-departures. So if you're running an Office of Study Abroad program, you're asked to do 2 pre-departures. So this will hopefully give you some interesting content or things to think about as you guide those student intercultural reflections and make it relevant to your courses. And we're going to reveal some of the common intercultural dynamic issues that you'll face when you're leading Tulane study abroad programs, and then also provide some resources that we have in our office for post-program reflection. So we'll get right in there. So first, we're going to do this to stay on time, just 2 minutes. I want you to think about programs that you've run in the past and what have been some of the cultural adaptation challenges that you've had with students. So those of you that have led programs, where are those moments where you've seen culture come up? What sort of challenges have you experienced when designing co-curricular activities for your students? So think about what has been the role of culture. And so for those of you who are new to this, who haven't led a program, think about, this might be the first time that you're dealing with kind of a student's development in an intercultural setting. So what do you think would be some of those challenges for you? And I'm going to keep us on a tight schedule, so this is within an hour. So I'm just giving you 2 minutes. With a person next to you, think of something that comes to mind where a student was challenged in cultural adaptation. So put that, I'll leave that to you. Go. And I'm timing it. 2 minutes.
The 2 that I was something single my private space. Feel like a word that you always ask. And then the other thing I try to do is I help your scanning. So or somebody says, oh, I can't believe you did that. Taking pictures without getting I don't know that, but it's not.
All right, you got 30 seconds.
But you're right, how do you learn what I don't necessarily know, you try to find someone, like you said, things, and maybe to them, they don't even
All right, thanks for starting. So I'm going to ask you to wrap it up and just share out loud with each other. What were some of the things that came up? Very briefly.
What you're sort of allowed to do culturally in Scandinavia, you don't just pet somebody's dog when they're walking, or you don't take pictures of things that just because you feel like taking a picture, you got to ask permission.
Great.
Or what you wear not understanding the religious concepts. I mean, because we were in an African culture but was Muslim. So students who came, in short
Standing
times couldn't get in,
Yeah,
couldn't
good.
get into school.
There's another one, having your hair wet while you're traveling the street, and you shouldn't wear it.
Yeah.
We talked about a lot of this being gender and having to deal with different gender dynamics.
Yeah, great. Anything else in this group over here? What did you guys talk about?
We sort of talked about on my program, though, when a lot of students don't really come in expecting there to be the same amount of cultural difference, and then they're very shocked. Like, so unaffected there are those subtle differences.
Yeah, great. So you guys are getting at these really important points that when students are traveling, and a lot of these students are traveling for the first time, especially on summer programs, we tend to deal with students that this might be their first time traveling. These elements of culture, they may not notice right away. And there's kind of two ends to this tension. One are these elements that, that you're bringing up where you find a culture that you think looks very similar, right? Scandinavia as an example, or Dublin as an example, where students expect that they're operating in the same cultural context. People relatively look like them, but then these little things come up where they're not, that are kind of these below the iceberg, which we'll get to in a second, elements of culture that really helps when you prepare them in the pre-departure orientation so that they're not just bombarded with it, and it helps their learning go faster along. And then the other things that you all are bringing up are moments where there might be a real culture shock that might cause a deep emotional reaction where the student needs some help and guiding. So especially these aspects around gender. So whether it's catcalling, whether it's being prepared to handle different ways in which their gender identities, racial identities, whatever difference is a difference that makes a difference in that culture might be addressed. So today we're going to talk about ways in which right from the start you can start to kind of set your program up with the most success. One is having students within their own context start to think about these differences in culture. So as you're doing these pre-departures, you're starting to have students become aware of culture, and you'll see that for many students they might say, well, I don't have a culture, or, I'm always, I don't know, being American as an identity might not have ever really come to them, or thinking about these lenses of difference when they're operating often in kind of the dominant cultural sphere might not be present. And then on the other side, for students that might be operating non-dominant identities, whatever they may be, there will be all kinds of reactions to what that will be like in country. So the more that you can do to create this sense of group dynamics and also create a sense of vulnerability, so creating kind of a safe space for your students to share with themselves, and also that they have an openness with you as a faculty. And so I find that first-time faculty members, this is a big shift, because this is kind of a difference from when you're leading courses in Tulane to when you're leading an experiential program and course where it's embedded in all aspects of who they are in the classroom and outside the classroom. It needs a sense of vulnerability from faculty that maybe you're not as used to in your setting. So we're going to talk a little bit about ways in which you sharing a bit about yourself, your own identities, ways that you've navigated, providing examples where you made a faux pas and had to work through it, are all ways that students start to feel more comfortable to share with you. So just very briefly, I'm not going to go into this very deeply, but we bring up this idea of culture and cultures, and students often will first go to those very visible elements of culture, right? The architecture that you see in Rome, or the way that the food that people eat, or the way people dress. But the real conflicts and the real moments of student growth, sort of along a developmental continuum, happen at the level below that, the sort of the ethics of why, the ways that people interact with each other, these communications that are getting at certain values that might be different. So I'm not going to go deep into this, but I'm happy to continue to talk about that if this is your first time leading these programs, and kind of one advice of how do you kind of make these invisible elements visible. In the field of intercultural learning and kind of study abroad, I want to just briefly show you this developmental continuum when we talk about culture, which can be useful for thinking about the types of experiences that students might have, moving from something like denial, where they might have an interaction and not even realize that culture is involved in that. And so there might be a thinking that, oh, this person is this way or that way, without realizing kind of the cultural elements to that. You might get into polarization. We see this a lot in study abroad, where students start to make judgments. They start to understand what they're feeling from their own mindset, right? So, you know, people in Senegal are like this, people in the US are like this, and this is better than that, or I like this, or I don't like that. So they're seeing their world from their kind of monocultural mindset that, you know, this is what is the norm, and then they're placing judgments. And it happens both ways. We also see students studying abroad who will come and say, wow, in Spain, they do everything right, and the US sucks, right? And so that again is the opposite. They're polarizing these experiences. And what we want to, as we're working with students, we want them to start to see more of these nuances. So when you have those moments where you see that a student is starting to go through this process, kind of really asking them to think deeply. On the continuum, what sort of the transitionary state is when they start, when students or groups start to kind of find commonality, intent and commonality. So what we have here is when we start to see that students start to go on, you know, core humanity, right? So they approach these cultural differences and say, you know, but we're all the same. You know, we all want these basic things. We all have a sense of we want a sense of belonging. You know, they may do things differently, but they really embrace difference. They're excited about difference. 65% of our students are going to fall in this way of thinking, kind of developmentally. And it's a really beautiful moment because people have very good intent. They really want to embrace difference. They really want to understand. But some of the pitfalls in minimization are sometimes not understanding the nuance of difference. So, you know, we have been navigating it this week a lot in the visa process, for example. So they might get really they approach diversity. They're excited about having an intercultural experience. But they may not realize, okay, so for an international student from the country I'm visiting to be able to come, their experience is completely different from mine. So those kind of nuances. And that's when we start getting into intercultural mindsets of really understanding on a more complex way that there are differences across cultures. So I just briefly show that continuum as you're thinking about your overall development of the students, because you'll find people falling in a lot of different places, and there are different ways in which you can address that. So with that, I think it's important to take a note, like think about study abroad sort of in this wider context. And so I give you this quote. Study abroad programs were built for an equity. Like it or not, international study was built for and is sustained by the elite. Acknowledging this outright may open our sight line to the concrete ways our education abroad origin story still influences the status quo. Despite our thirst for difference, international educators are inculcated by decades of programming designed for the most privileged students in the most privileged societal spheres abroad. From our financial aid processes to the admission criteria, visa requirements to security procedures, we rely on systems designed to support an archetype that doesn't represent most US students. That is, of course, systemic bias, and we have to start the conversation by saying so. So I bring that up as you all are thinking about your program design and study abroad as a field, really emerging out of post World War II diplomacy as a way of a peace building mission, right? And so the inequities that might be involved in terms of that whole process of exchange are important to show and reveal to students. And also just thinking yourself about, what is your role as a faculty member engaged in this kind of work? Where are the moments that you can think really critically about your co-curricular programming that might shift the needle on that, or at least make visible some of those ways where this might become present in the way that you're touring. So it could be everything from, okay, if I'm leading this art history course and you're talking about sort of museums and the development of knowledge and how we put knowledge on display, and also thinking about the ways in which those things play out in day-to-day lives might create this link between history and present day. And so a lot of courses, art historians are trained and kind of helping students think about this. But this should ideally kind of be help with all the mentorship moments that you have, be sort of working through these, thinking about breaking down archetypes that do exist in the field. And so even when you're thinking about the design and working with your on the ground partners, really thinking about this consciously in terms of, what privileges do I have as I'm asking for certain things? Can I myself shift in terms of thinking about engagement, and COVID, especially at this time, what is ethical and not ethical in terms of how you might engage. I won't go through this very long, but this is sort of a timeline of sort of the development of our field, as I mentioned, through this World War II, and then thinking about diverse identities, and the fact that this idea of, if we're also shifting the student body that is doing this kind of work that we want to engage and study abroad, it also means that we think really strategically about how we're helping those voices feel included. So what are the ways in which you're thinking strategically about students that might be first-time travelers, that you're thinking strategically about ways in which you might be playing an extra role in sort of helping that process, because study abroad, just allowing students to go is not enough. Not just opening the finances is not enough if we're not supporting. So as we sort of build these more diverse cohorts, to think really critically about how that plays out. So again, in your pre-departure orientations, a really useful metaphor that I like to use with students is the iceberg metaphor. And you see it in a lot of different fields, people also doing social design thinking. You see it in public health a lot, but just having students kind of articulate these things that are kind of, wow, it's a big rain on the outside, the top of the iceberg, and then all of these things going on beneath it. And it's a good kind of in beginning to discussions. For example, in your pre-departure, you can show this model, talk through it, and say, what are the things, what's your culture look like? And you'll have some students who are like, well, I don't know even how to define my culture. They've never really thought of it before. Or some people that really have a strong sense of identity here that need to think about how those things might shift in the international context. And so the more that you can kind of set them up for success, when they have these moments of conflict that usually we see always kind of happening in that below the iceberg moment, they're more prepared to deal with it. So I think thinking about how from the very beginning that we're setting students up is helpful. Another kind of useful image that I often use in pre-departures are thinking about helping students shift perspective. So in this image, for example, can you guys see the young woman, the old woman, and the duck? Everyone see them? Good, yeah. So it's a familiar, for those this is the profile of the old woman. That's her nose and mouth, and then that's the nose of the young woman looking at the duck. It's a classic model, but sort of in introducing students this idea of sort of shifting perspectives, that there are more than one ways to look at something. So when you have these moments where students are in a sense of conflict, emotionally about what's going on, that we can have them take a step back and think about how they're going to shift their perspectives. Does anyone have any advice for how they've done it on program?
We'll try to see the second perspective.
The young woman?
The nose is her chin.
I used to know there's one of this stuff jumping out, but that's fine, I'll work on it. Oh, there it is, I see.
Is it that little tiny nose? Yeah, yeah.
Temporarily.
Yeah, so, you know, these visuals with students are often very, very helpful. And so, and it provides kind of a fun influence in of, okay, so what are the ways that you're going to have to shift perspective on site, and how do we kind of work through that? And then also preparing students for elements and moments of culture shock. So there are a lot of different models of this that you can show visually. Sometimes it's the kind of the bell curve of the honeymoon of, you know, when you get there, a lot of excitement. And so you're feeling really great. And then there's usually a moment of you're tired and exhausted, and your emotions are going to go way down. And so, and it's not that it'll constantly kind of do this up and down, right? And showing and preparing students that they're going to feel that. They're going to get there. They're going to have so much excitement. Emotionally, they're going to be ready to go. And then they're in their housing, and there's conflicts with their roommates, and they're not understanding the language, and they're trying to order at a cafe, and they're not quite able to communicate how they want to, or they're talking loud in a bus and someone snaps at them. So all of these little things so that students are aware. And this is another model that sort of shows how you can help students conceptualize that in terms of their overall growth. So along the developmental model, these moments of dissonance and stress are what propel you forward, right? Are what propel that learning forward. And so as leaders, that we're kind of attuned to what is happening and where students might be on a given moment, and how to kind of help them understand that, you know, while they're having a bad day, or while this might feel particularly difficult at this time, it will get better, and they're on a positive journey. So kind of setting them up in your pre-departure in this way is helpful. I forgot a slide in there. I forgot to send the updated slide. So a couple of things. I'm just gonna say this out loud, and when I send a new PowerPoint version, I'll give you some tips. And for Office of Study Abroad, you have, we ask you to do 2 pre-departures, and you can kind of break this up how you want. But in the first session, in general, when we're talking about intercultural learning, some of the things that we want you to include in there are one, to kind of review your courses. So make sure that you have your course enrollments correct. Make sure, for those of you teaching on programs with more than one program, make sure that you review your syllabus. You explain how your program is really going to connect to, your coursework is going to connect to local content. And you're going to talk about setting expectations for yourself and for your students in terms of their, along this development continuum, right? So that we've just been discussing. So you might figure out ways in which you are explaining yourself that mentorship role, and really embracing the fact that you're gonna come to them as a mentor and be there outside of the kind of the classroom experience that they may have had in the past with faculty. In that intercultural work session, we really want you to engage student fears and student concerns around elements. So, you know, what might they be afraid of in terms of COVID in their context? What elements of identity might they worry about in terms of gender? What things might they not even know because they haven't even done the research but that you know they might face, and that we're preparing them. And then that you really get to know your group's identities. And so this isn't just what you can see physically when someone walks into the room, but that you're really getting to know all the different ways in which student dynamics might play out, that you're really setting up your students to succeed, and that you are setting the tone for the importance of their research about local cultural contexts and set that up in a lot of different ways. It could be that you're going to help share some exciting music that they could get into, or a newspaper that they could follow, or just something so that they're starting to think about that, their local context. And then the second one, which we're going to concentrate on in the health and safety pre-departure, is where you're also going to go through kind of relevant travel information, getting through the airport, reviewing health and safety, expectations around their housing and meals, and the Tulane travel policy. All that we're going to do next in the next session. So, but I just wanted to give you those tips somewhat to kind of include in your first pre-departure. Sorry, I missed the slide, but it will be in the slideshow that I attach. Great, I'm going to pause there. Any questions about that? All right, so a few tips as you all now are starting to develop your site visits and experiential learning. One thing, for those of you that are teaching courses, and then you have these, you'll find that on programs, you'll have certain visits and site visits and experiential visits that are very closely linked to your course. You're taking your students to see this thing, and that makes sense. And then there's also elements always on these programs where all students are going, and it may be it's relevant to your course, but maybe tangentially, or maybe you're going to visit something that is kind of a major landmark that students want to see, but how does it quite fit in with the overall course content? How do you frame it for students? All of that is really, really important. So these, and some of you are very familiar with doing this kind of cultural work, and it's very much embedded in what you're doing in your coursework. But even small things such as these ideas of before you get on the bus, so they're not just following you like little ducks on the bus. Where are we going? I have no idea. We're just on an excursion, right? But that you're really helping set up what's happening, and you're blocking in time for reflection. Whether it's okay, you're gathered as a group. What are we doing? Where are we going? Why? That they're asking those questions, and they have time to reflect with you about this stuff. So, words, ideas, concepts that are unfamiliar to them in these experiences, asking them to kind of you setting the scene for what's happening, defining unfamiliar moments, preparing questions that might guide them. So in a lot of the cases, especially with COVID, you may have social distancing where you cannot take the full group with you all the time, or you may be dealing with a class size that you can't work through that space in a way with everyone together. So thinking strategically about, what questions might you give them going in that their brains are turning, so that as they're walking through that space, they're able to think about the themes that you think will be important, that you think could help them develop along this continuum that we've been talking about. And then constantly relating this back to courses. And I think as a team of faculty, the more time that you all are able to sort of engage in that sense of teamwork, of what are you teaching in your course? What are the overlaps between what's happening in your course and what's happening in mine, so that students really do feel the content as being alive, and that these disciplines have a sense of connection, and as they embrace their learning and on different challenges or on different issues in their host country context, that they really do see that they can make connections between physics and neuroscience and art history, for example, that there are ways in which we can do that, and guiding students through that is really, really important, and does often take planning in your schedule, because these short-term faculty-led are very intense. It's very tiring, and you have to think about that too, as when are students ready to do that and feel that. How do we sort of, you might find yourself shifting this as you go along, that, okay, wait, today, emotionally, they can't take it in. We have to take a pause. I might have to cut something here or use class time. So being flexible about these things. Yeah, please.
I find these prompts very useful. And I'm wondering if you and your program or others have used other prompts that are a little bit more explicit about reflections on students' own identity as they intersect with the.
Yeah, definitely. I think I like to do that, especially in pre-departure work with students, to really ask very driven questions and create a space of vulnerability with the students from the beginning as much as possible. So I would say that's one place where I really put it in there. And then another time there's, so you kind of figure out when they've had enough experiences in country that they're able to sort of give some examples of things that they've noticed that are different. So usually I try to, I would say in that on-site orientation, so pre-departure, and that on-site orientation, and then a couple of sort of intervention moments throughout that would do this thing. And these are very broad, obviously, but I think you could really tailor these to your particular context. Yeah.
And I would say, because Annie's been on this, but I would say that doing it early sets the tone that you're going to do these, and then doing them periodically. And I appreciate your comment to say sometimes they're just too tired. You'd be wasting your time to do it. They'd rather not. But if they get the idea that this is expected of it, and we sometimes did where we would just, because we had a Canvas site for our whole group, and we would tell them, we want you to upload your reflection so they could take whatever time they wanted to do it, so it wasn't always oral. And I appreciated that, because sometimes you want them to be face-to-face where they can talk. Other times, particularly with a quiet student not going to say anything, if you say, look, upload your comments to it, and then sometimes you get really good insights from what they think of. But then they have a little more time to think about it, and that's the one spot.
We ran through, I remember Corey Island, Senegal, so much information. You really couldn't have a conversation until we got back.
Yeah, and in fact, the example of Goree Island, we had a very intense emotional experience that happened. So at that moment, emotions were really, really high. And so we had a quick intervention where students were allowed to sort of express what was going on, express how they felt emotionally, but then also put a pause, and then we constantly went back to it. And then we also thought about, ways we could have done it better from the beginning, right? Next go around, to set it up for them to have that emotion, understand that emotional, what might happen for them emotionally. So, these things, you never quite know what's going to happen on site. And so I think with this development work, being really, really in tuned to the emotional flows of the group or the emotional flows of the individual, and kind of knowing when to have those moments of intervention is important. And I think, working as a faculty group to do it, and also to figure out who's the right person to do this at this particular time. It may be me at one moment because a particular student feels more comfortable with me, but maybe it's Tim at another moment because of aspects of gender, or because of ways in which that student dialogue. So that is also something, as you kind of develop your team and your mentorship, kind of having that sense of understanding among students. Okay, a few notes about the co-curricular planning during the pandemic. I will say reach out to the faculty on the Italy program from last summer if you want some advice on this, but it is a constant sense of flexibility that you'll need to embrace during the pandemic. This could be the ways in which making reservations follow a whole new paradigm than what you knew pre-pandemic. It might be that while you're on site, all of a sudden social distancing policies change. And so you'll have to, flip your classroom right away because you can't go in the classroom with your students. They have to do individual visits. And so kind of being going with the flow on that, and also helping the students do that as well. Sometimes it might be a shift in your curriculum that's going to happen. Sometimes it might be a pause to think about how COVID works in this global context, and that's part of it. as members of this journey, the Tulane culture that we need to remember is that all students need to have an academic continuance plan. So if you have a student that is in quarantine, if you have a student that needs to, or a faculty member, what would you do if you need to quarantine? So thinking about that as you do your prep and plan. And embracing that with flexibility. So, you can't just say, my whole class is based on experiential visits to museums and I have to isolate now, so class, doesn't exist, right? You need to figure out how to think about how you would sort of deal with that. So right away, starting to get yourself familiar with the social distancing practices in country so that you're thinking strategically about your plan A and plan B. And then lastly, having what are the ethics for doing this work? So relating back to those slides where we talked about, power and privilege in the sphere of study abroad with engagement with locals. And so, study abroad and the way it's designed can often feel sort of like this bubble program in the summer. You take these students as a group and they stay within their own group. And what we're trying to do is constantly find ways for them to engage, whether that's with local students, whether that's with having them think about their local cultural context in new ways. And I will say that the pandemic makes all of these discussions, which were always already difficult to think about how to guide students, because you're kind of forcing, you're having to create spaces where that engagement exists. Now is more complicated because you also have to think about the ethics of engagement in terms of going into communities that might not have the same vaccination rates, in terms of norms that may have shifted where it's just not as easy to connect students in the same ways. So thinking very, very creatively about that. So we're going to take, this is again, not much time. You all have these case studies on your desk. And with a pair there, I'd like you to choose one that is in a country or in a context that you think is closest to where you're going to be navigating. And you're going to have this as a reference, so you can go back to this and think about other scenarios. But all these are examples of a moment of conflict around that developmental continuum that we were talking about. So moments where culture is in conflict and that the faculty member has a moment where intervention is possible. So choose one. I'm going to only give you 3 minutes on this and just brainstorm some solutions to how you would navigate that conflict. Just choose one, choose just one person to pair up with, or it could be a 3, but we only have 3 minutes to do this. So rapid brainstorming, go.
Yeah, well, that's why the only thing all the others were class and some activities. I would say we talk about reading, we can, we just have to, again, I think plan some stuff. Yes, and I think one of the things you can start out with first reflection meetings, and then guys you have I think again, it's going to start with us. Whatever rules happen, whatever rules for Tulane still here. I want to say, you know, you're not, kind of make that really clear. You have to be and I think that's a good question. Yeah. I mean.
It's one thing.
One of the things that's nice about there being multiple levels is they make us
Yeah. I'm gonna, for time, I'm gonna wrap us up here, but I see great conversation happening.
Okay, our question is, what legally can we or can we not do if a student is doing bad behavior or something? What are our liabilities?
Yeah, great. Okay, so liability. So students must follow the academic and disciplinary policies of Tulane. So disciplinary actions that they do, on program that they are violating, they are subject to Tulane's disciplinary policy. So for example, if the policy is no drinking in their hotel and dorms, and you have a student that has a party and alcohol in their dorms, they're subject to Tulane disciplinary policy. You contact the Office of Study Abroad. They go through that whole process. Does that answer the question?
What about something more ambiguous, like
Yeah.
the Berlin scenario?
Yeah.
Right? That's
Remind me what my Berlin scenario was.
They go off the guy.
Oh, yes, yes. So the, in terms of travel policy, right? You all are setting expectations around these travel policy for students. And so if you have a policy in general, the policy is that students have to sign off where they're going. And if they don't get the sign off, then that's an example of violating the policy of the program, and they're subject to
But even if
disciplinary
it's
actions.
let's say pet policy is no traveling, but it's like Tim said, what if it's just a gate in the city that you don't trust?
Yeah, so those are these really hard things to navigate. You can't really tell a student. You can tell a student, like, for example, there might be a protest happening that you could say don't go, or a neighborhood that you could say don't go. But it is really hard to navigate what they're doing in their free time and with who. So I think intervening in the sense of open communication. We don't support you doing this. What is your backup? Why, if you're going someplace with cell phone range, you could say no, because they're required to have emergency contact 24/7 with you. If not, that's a violation of the policy. Now, if it's something else, they're going to a bar with someone they met on Tinder and they might go sleep with them afterward. Thinking about, what is their, talking them through, what is the plan, right? So what is your safety plan? Tell me your safety plan. How are you gonna handle this? What does dating look like in your host country? So what kind of signals might you be giving if you're going on this date in short shorts and an athletic bra? What signals might you be giving that you don't know that you're giving? Or what dating norms might you be dealing with that you don't know about? And so some of that stuff might be pre-departure or on site when you're talking about gender or identities. And some is kind of intervention in the moment when you learn about it. Meredith and then Karen.
Yeah, I just like to just share an example. So one of 2018, we had a student that ended the program, beyond the dates responsible for them wanted to travel to Belfast for a weekend and walk around. Fun weekend is what they decided. And so we had a discussion with the students saying, obviously it's not to do this, it's not like program dates, but here's what you need to know about why
Carol, what were your?
Mine was just on, you know, when you take, students who identify differently, queer and trans students in countries where it has major challenges around conversation about that.
Yeah, that's a really important one as you're thinking about knowing the politics and laws around certain things, right? So everything from queer and trans identities, and is there extra work that you need to do and letting them know about it, and also preparing them emotionally, because they've probably done a ton of work to be able to be open, and all of a sudden there might be a real danger in being open. And so how do you help them navigate that? And it can also be laws, as Beth can help us talk about, in terms of, you know, what are cultural norms around drinking, and how could that have legal implications for you if you're violating that? So on both ends.
And I would add, we had an issue with being a person of color in a very white, it was Sweden. And what they noticed was sort of the underlying, it was never overt, but it was sort of covert kind of comments and stuff. And they weren't used to that because they were so moral. I mean, they could go to school there where everybody's accepted, and then all of a sudden they would get this stuff, which that came up as an issue. And we really weren't aware of it until the students started talking, and they were saying how just things that they were observing that they had never seen in the norms before.
And I have a question. So it's my first time leading this program, even though I've taught study abroad for 12 years. So and we also had different rules last year because of COVID. A lot of things were just different. So what I'm wondering is, when you were saying like we are setting expectations, like can we find you guys have like resources for what the rules are for study abroad generally, like what they're agreeing to, and then what we have discretion to kind of outline in terms of our expectations?
Yes. So if you're on an Office of Study Abroad program, I would suggest meet with your advisor to meet up. So we have certain waivers that students sign that they're saying that the rules that they'll follow in terms of their participation. So you can see that sort of outlined in the things that they're signing. We're also going to talk a little bit more about that in the health and safety in terms of travel. So the next one, we'll talk a little bit more of kind of rules around discipline and travel, and what that kind of looks like in terms of policy. And I would say, yeah, I mean, I think the more that we're putting those things on the front end for students, the better. Yeah. But yeah, get with Mike, because he can share with you who's kind of doing the logistics moving
Is it all
on.
different for every program, those waiver, or is it
The waivers are the same for OSA programs.
Get a waiver sent to us so we can see it?
Yeah, we can send examples of all the things being signed. Yeah.
Is it the same waiver that's already on Teradata that the students are already signed?
It's all the things on Teradata.
I don't know where that is. Is it on the side setting to me?
Yeah. So
Except
Yeah.
me too.
yeah. So we also, just out of capacity issues, we are happy to train faculty on how to navigate finding the forms on Teradata, or looking a bit so that you can go back and see that, and see that students, but in general, we take care of it for you. But I think part of the kind of the shift in culture of how we're doing these programs is we really want faculty to take a leadership role in these things, just because we don't have the capacity all the time to do it. And so that's part of these trainings now, is to try to onboard some of this stuff and have it be a continual learning process between us all. Because of time, I'm going to cut short some of the debrief on these discussions, but happy to take more examples or questions about these afterward, and hopefully it can also be an ongoing conversation. But I think as broad categories, things to think about that we'll give you, I'm going to give you a few just kind of tips about. One is directing intercultural learning when cultures feel very similar. That's one thing that we talked about. Directing intercultural learning when the content that you're teaching doesn't appear cultural, right? You're teaching a physics course or a neuroscience course, and you're trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to think about students' development, but I have all this science content that I'm supposed to teach. Where are my moments of intervention in this thing? And then the last one are these tips of guiding culture shock, or moments where there's intervention is needed. So we're going to go briefly through this. And again, this is kind of an ongoing, development for all of us as well. So cultural barriers and effective communication. We see this happen a lot in programs where cultures seem similar, that students look around and they're assuming that people will respond in their own mindset. So we talked about this in terms of those examples from Dublin as an example, and having students bringing the values that might come up in different ways forward. So I think the example, was it the Dublin example on the sheet of a student that might feel, they think everything's the same, people are going to interact the same way, but then something different happens and they feel just totally caught off guard because, they think this man is hitting on them because they're interacting culturally in a different way than they're used to gender interactions happening. Or they're thinking that it's okay to, wear the midriff shirt, but in fact, they're being interpreted in all of these different ways. So really concentrating, thinking about talking with students about verbal communication, but also couching this as kind of these nonverbal communications. That's those below the iceberg ways in which certain values are being communicated. So what's the value that's being communicated when you make this choice or when you make this decision? And also having students think about that in their moments of conflict. So when you have this moment where some communication issue happened and you feel caught off guard by it, to help them, okay, let me take a step back. Let me describe what happened. Let me interpret what I think has happened. And let me think about it from other perspectives, right? Let me shift perspectives. What might be the way in which actually what I think is happening is something different. And so that's a process that students are learning and are those moments of intervention. The other thing that we've discussed today, excuse me, is really thinking about mentorship and making culture visible. And so as you're designing your courses and as you're designing your programs, you're really thinking about ways in which you are centering host country culture and learning. So you're thinking about ways that to have them engage, practice their language skills, or you're thinking about having them think about research in the context of your host country culture, that the ways in which one does research might look really different. The sources that you cite on your syllabi, you may shift so that you're incorporating who's doing research on these subjects in your area. That you're setting up your programs, again, as we mentioned, that there's pre and post debriefs. And those are really also a great check-in for you to be able to understand, when do you have a student that is in an emotional shock moment that could use some intervention. And it's not always, in fact, I would say in a lot of cases, because we're talking about so much intergroup dynamics, a lot of this intercultural work is actually happening among the students in your own program. So that work is really, really, really important. And everything, and finding out those check-ins, finding this is how you know that it happens. It's how you keep a student from going into polarization and just shutting down to helping them kind of move forward. And so, case studies, readings, research techniques that you're thinking about your local cultural context about those things. A list of some of the things that cause these intensity factors where students may find a conflict arising. So the more the difference, the greater the likelihood of the dissonance. Also, at the same time, us being very conscious of moments of ethnocentrism when students are placing value, are thinking from a particular lens, and ways in which we can provide alternate ways for them to shift perspective. Cultural isolation, so you have a student that may feel isolated from her group, who may feel like she can't share her identity, either within the cohort or because in the wider context that is not something that could be dangerous for that person. So helping the student go through that. Language, when they're tired and they're dealing in another language, that there's a real moments of conflict. Expectations, thinking, this is going to be the most awesome experience. And then all of a sudden, there's a lot of dissonance, there's a lot of difficulty. That's another moment where you might see a student kind of in that moment of shock. This idea of making culture more visible, understanding that they might have a different status, whether that's for their particular identity, whether that's the fact of making visible the fact as American students, they have privilege in doing that. And so this is, I think, particularly important to kind of think through with students that in the context of the US have a marginalized identity. And so when they take that into the study abroad context, in fact, they're carrying a lot of privilege, and having those conversations is interesting with students. It's also difficult, and they may not be received in the ways that they perceive themselves. And so kind of working through those things, and who has power and who has control. And all of those intensity factors cause cultural fatigue. And so we've also talked today about the sort of reminding students of the up and down, going away from overly romanticizing life at home or life in the US, emphasize difference and the differences in all the different scenarios. So while we're teaching about national cultural constructs, there are so many diverse identities within Italy, within Stockholm, within wherever your program is running, and really helping students see that there's this national framework, but we're also working on this other framework, and cultivating these skills of cross-cultural competence, navigating bureaucracies that might be hard and challenging in different contexts, and having them think about patience, curiosity, and being there for them in terms of, that you're available. You're not just there for them in the classroom, you're available for them as they navigate all these things. And whether it's a coffee and a walk after, or whether it's the fact that you're having to go to someone's apartment and navigate a moment of extreme difficulty, or it's in the hospital because they have a stomach ache, or you're playing so many roles. Okay, so I also want to say that in the intercultural, in this kind of development model for students, the study abroad does not end when the course ends, and that the students are going to continue to reflect upon this experience far after. And the more that we can do, and this is often hard with students returning because everyone gets into their new life, but post-program debriefing is really positive experience. Time for them to get together, think about their experience, how it's shifted their goals, et cetera, is really important. A couple of things that are kind of built in that we do, and we'd love to partner with you more on this. We have Global Cafe every Tuesdays, 2 to 4 in the mezzanine of the LBC. So it's an easy add-on if you're available at that time to come meet your group there, have some coffee, talk about how things went, talk about what they're doing now. We have a mentorship program where students can get involved with international students on campus. So thinking about their experience here, students going through this here at Tulane, how they can get involved. We have students that work for us as returnees, so helping mentor students who are going to go through the study abroad experience. We have the Global Observer, which is a way that students can write and reflect about their experience abroad. And we can also connect them with other offices. I was thinking I should have added, we have a fellowship advising office, for example, that can teach them about fellowship opportunities to get abroad again. We can talk to them about international post-grad opportunities. So things like that, that is helpful and useful. So I think I've ended on time here, but I'm available for questions or if anyone has comments. And again, the next session is gonna focus more on health, safety, travel, these sort of disciplinary policies that you may be working with students. And again, this will be recorded. I'm gonna share it with you along with the slides. Please send it to those in your group that are not here, and think about, is some of this content maybe useful for what you're developing with your pre-departures on site. So thanks for taking the time during a busy day. I appreciate it.